We were dominating the land. We were moving in here to turn it into wetlands, into farmland. We were turning the prairies into farmland. So we were pretty aggressive kind of people. So what that did, it got a lot of people like Pammel, Shimmick and Macbride and others, including Ding Darling, concerned about conservation, that we were moving too fast, developing things too quickly without concern for erosion and for protection of the natural lands.
In the 1920s, there were a few people that had the vision to establish a system of state parks, and they identified some properties that were really unique, and as far as geological features, they were very scenic, they were unusual pieces of property, set aside for science when they first.
This is a book that was published in 1919. It's a report from the Board of Conservation. So these were folks back in the early 1900s who were thinking about a state park system. And they came together and provided some guidance, and they went so far as to make recommendations on what areas ought to become state parks. And I think the one important thing here is that Iowa parks back at this time were defined for their purpose as being conservation of Iowa historic, scenic, and scientific areas. And it's interesting because they don't talk about recreation at all. And of course, that's a big part of state parks today.
So the first people who worked on the park system really looked at it from a science-based. It's important to keep these areas for science purposes. Then as time passed in the 1940s and 50s, things changed.
Over time, we moved into the 40s and 50s, we started to move into more urbanization. People were moving off the farms and moving into manufacturing and service industries. So now we started to shift to maybe 50% rural, 50% urban. So now in the urban setting, the people and the demand started to shift a little bit.
Iowa became more populated. There were more people coming to Iowa. They're looking for recreation.
They needed them for family, for recreational use for their families, and to gain kind of a refreshing time.
And then at that time, the Department of Natural Resources, of course it was called the Iowa Conservation Commission at that time, recognized the need for recreation. And they looked at state parks simply from a standpoint that as more and more people want to get out and hike and walk and bicycle on these properties. So they no longer needed just only those scientific areas, they just needed some public land to create parks. So there's a time period there where the state purchased property. A lot of those, they built an artificial lake. They actually built a lake on those properties and then built a park around them to add the picnic areas and campgrounds, all geared toward people that looking for outdoor recreation activities. Fishing was big, picnicking, hiking, all that stuff that people's backyards weren't big enough to do that, but they could go to one of these parks and have plenty of space to do all those activities. And then in the 70s and 80s, the state emphasized larger areas.
And now you fast forward into the 70s where camping became very popular, kind of the back to the earth movement, get outdoors. So the parks expanded. There had already been a great system of lodges and beaches and some cabins that were built during the Civilian Conservation Corps era of the 1930s. And then in the 1970s, those were expanded to have other amenities, especially upgraded camping facilities, nature centers, especially trails and those amenities.
A lot of our older parks, they may be 300 or 400 acres, which is a pretty good size, but not nearly big enough to do a lot of diversive activities where we were getting into now cross-country skiing, snowmobiling, some more fishing. So then there was an emphasis to create what we call recreation areas, not parks, but these large recreation areas were like 3,000 or 4,000 or 5,000 acres in size, and they would be centered around a lake. And on these areas, you could hunt and fish and snowmobile and bicycle in them. and there's a lot more space for everybody to do a lot different recreational activities. And so that's basically where we are today. Early days starting out with those scientific areas, those high valued resources. Then it emphasized in the mid-50s with the for outdoor recreation activities. And then in the modern time, these large areas where people can get into, lots of people can attend to them and do many, many activities in the parks. The County Conservation Board, they're a local government, county government agency. They purchase land and take care of property for county parks and county wildlife areas and environmental areas. So, if you will, they're kind of like mini Iowa Department of Natural Resources or Iowa State Park Systems. They're geared toward property and parks in their county, and then they get their money from county tax dollars, separate from the state dollars that the state park system get.
In the early 1950s, the legislature authorized all of the counties in the state to undertake a referendum. And out of that, if the local citizens voted to create a county conservation board, then one was created. So it started at the grassroots. The people had to ask for it, it had to be put on a ballot, and then the conservation boards were created. So now we have 99 county conservation boards.
And they fill a lot of void because what they do is then we have parks in every county. So if you aren't blessed with a state park near you, in your county, there's a system of county parks that you can go camping and hiking in.
Most of all of the long distance trails in Iowa, especially the former railroads that have been converted to trails, almost all of those are managed by county conservation agencies, almost all of them.
And it's a pretty unique that every county in Iowa has that county park system. And we look at them in the state park system as just beneficiary. We work together hand in hand. We share equipment sometimes. We share staff. We do projects. We do interpretive programs together. And it's just kind of a working relationship that Iowa should be very proud to have because overall, it makes all of our park system better.
There's no doubt about it that having them managed and owned locally, people are a little, they feel more secure because the people that serve on those local boards are their neighbors and they know them and their friends, so they are more secure.
It's interesting, all you got to do is look at our names of our state parks, and some of these state parks have been named after these people. Like Lake Macbride State Park was named after Thomas Macbride, which was one of the earlier, I believe he was professor in the University of Iowa in the early 1900s, and he was actually very instrumental in creating a system of state parks in Iowa, and he thought there was a need to set these places.
Ada Hayden, a woman who was one of the real pioneers in setting aside prairies in the state.
Aldo Leopold wrote about it in the Sam County Almanac, and which has become one of the most famous books in history about the concern for ethics and conservation.
Lewis Pammel, we have a Pammel State Park, and Lewis Pammel was also very instrumental back then.
But on the other side was Ning Darling, who by visuals, cartooning, which people understand in many ways, understand quicker than if you're trying to sit down and read it. Here by the cartoons which he would put in the newspapers, people quickly grasp what the problem was, just by a visual, by a cartoon. So one picture is worth 1,000 words. There's the example.
And Margot Franco State Park here in the north side of Des Moines.
Major John Lacey.
Iowa has had this rich heritage of conservation leaders, clear back to the beginning, and so we've always been a leader in that. And in some ways now we've fallen backwards. We've underfunded our natural resource conservation. We've underfunded our parks, and that's why this Green Ribbon Commission and what's proposed for the state park system is so important, because it's all about getting our parks in premier condition and looking to what new areas ought to be created and or how we ought to improve what we've got, including linking them with a system of trails.